Morning, Byron.
Good morning, Mark. How you doing?
Very good, very good. Should we introduce ourselves? I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm the executive editor of the American Prospect magazine.
And I am Byron York. I am chief political correspondent with the Washington Examiner.
Great. And I don't think I've talked to you since you went over to the Examiner, so congratulations on that.
Well, thank you very much.
Your face is plastered on news boxes all over town.
And I hope it makes it just I hope it makes you just want to read even more of the Examiner.
It does. There's a lot to read out there, though, in the world.
All right. So as we speak, the president has kind of unveiled his buck stops here approach to the security problems revealed by the Christmas Day attempted bombing. Mm-hmm. And what strikes me is that I watched ABC on Thursday night, and they went to a segment with George Stephanopoulos, who, of course, is famously speaks to Rahm Emanuel. And Stephanopoulos said something to the effect that they kind of hope in the White House that this will be, Obama's taking responsibility for this, will be kind of like another Democratic president a while back, John F. Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, where he just came out and admitted we messed up, and then his popularity soared. That's apparently the hope in the White House. I haven't heard that myself, but I believe Stephanopoulos is well sourced on that. And so do you believe the president's popularity will soar now that he has admitted that the administration kind of messed up in this Christmas Day attempted bombing?
No, I don't think it'll have a huge effect on the president's popularity either way, especially as, I mean, this was not actually a major terrorist event, as it turned out. I think the interesting thing is that still, this is kind of the underwear bomber is kind of the best that Al Qaeda can put together without a lot of support, or actually the ability to actually pull some of these things off. So I don't think that it's had a major effect either way. I do think it's essential. I mean, I think it's kind of essential for the president to take ownership of the fact. I don't know that, there's not a dramatic action, a dramatic change. I mean, the Bay of Pigs was a pretty significant, we are not going to do this kind of crazy thing again moment. This is much more a matter of kind of small changes. So I don't think it has quite the same.
Well,
I wouldn't expect it to have quite the same effect as any kind of dramatic boost in popularity.
I agree with you on that. But yesterday's or Thursday's kind of contrition tour at the White House was interesting in the sense that John Brennan, the president's counterterrorism advisor, came out and said, "I told the president, I failed you," and we heard a lot of self-criticism from the administration, which was a striking difference from its early approach to the incident, in which the president called Abdul Muttalib an isolated extremist, and where as we know, the director of the Counterterrorism Center actually went on vacation the day after, and Leon Panetta stayed on vacation. And the reason I think that there was not this sort of mobilization across the administration about this was that there was a message from the top that this was not a big deal. The president went out and played golf after this happened, and sort of administration mouthpieces were suggesting that the president is not going to get overly excited about that. They believe the Bush administration had used the fear of terrorism to sort of stir up the American people for political purposes. The president would not do that. One reporter even said the president was going to project his calm onto the American people. And I think that the message from the top was, this is not a big deal. And now the message from the top is, this is a big deal, and we're going to all say we're going to do better. And that's why we saw what we saw.
Well, I mean, maybe. I think it's, I guess that's actually a good way of putting together the timeline. I was pretty sympathetic to the first approach because, I mean, we live in a world where these kinds of attempts are going to happen. And, we can't, obviously, each each one, in hindsight, you can say what was the thing that you should have been doing, but the fact is you're not going to be able to do all the things that are going to stop, relatively lone people. You could stop something as elaborate as the 9/11 plot. I don't think that you can that you can disrupt everything, that every relatively lone person, obviously operating with some support. But yeah, there is. In a way, the calm is the same thing. The calm is instead of getting all flibbity jibbity on the day that the news breaks, you do the bureaucratic analysis. You gather that information, you put it out calmly. I could see them being sort of a piece, and not a complete not a complete 180 in their approach. It is it is the smoother approach, like find out what we know, release it when we know it, and then be clear about the things that you want to change.
But the initial approach actually was that the system worked, and not just in what Napolitano's words, that there had been this defense from the administration that it was entirely proper that Abdul Muttalib's name was not put on a no-fly list. Because it didn't trigger the criteria necessary to be put on the no-fly list. And then the president had to come out a couple of days later, this was when he was still in Hawaii, and say, well, yes, he should have. So right. This has been a climb down, it seems to me. They're in a bigger sense, the whole approach of the left was to downplay the threat of terrorism. I remember Marcos Molitzis of the Daily Kos wrote, I think it was in 2006, when I don't remember the circumstances, but perhaps the terror warning, code had been raised or something like that. And he wrote, "Why are these Republicans so afraid? They piddle themselves every time Osama bin Laden says boo." And there was this sense that the Democrats would handle this differently. So you get this terrorist incident. By the way, we already had one that left 13 dead in Fort Hood, Texas, and the president was very slow to recognize that. You get this terrorist incident. And it could have been disastrous. Wasn't, but it could have been. Mm-hmm. And the president, there's this downplaying across the administration. And then when that doesn't fly, there is all of a sudden a realization that this is quite important, and they go through sort of a top-to-bottom review and decide that they could have done better here, here, and here. By the way, they say, I think, that they want to make the Bush-era system work better. This incident has not, I believe, motivated them to make any major changes other than to say that we need to make this system that we have work better.
Right. Well, I'd like to see one major change, which is it's time for somebody to say the whole Homeland Security Administration scheme was probably one of the worst bureaucratic rearrangements in American history, and the way we're gonna punish Joe Lieberman is by destroying his creation and putting together something that actually works.
Well, I wouldn't actually disagree with you on that. That was rushed together in the period after September 11th. And, why, for example, is FEMA under the Homeland Security Department? You got me. Is the TSA set up the way it should be? I think these are absolutely reasonable questions to ask.
Right.
So, now, on the other hand, I believe Obama on Thursday, after he finally addresses this whole terrorism thing, immediately goes into a meeting about health care. Where they're still, contemplating how to get these House and Senate bills together, whether it's going to be ping pong or whether it's going to be a more traditional conference. Nancy Pelosi apparently had a conference call with well over 100 members of the House Democratic Caucus in which they kind of talked this out. And I know that one issue that has arisen out of this, because it was so difficult for Democrats to get all 60 Democrats in the Senate on board for this. One issue that has arisen is the majority party's perpetual frustration with the filibuster. And I know Ezra Klein of the left-wing blogger on the Washington Post has written extensively about why we need, quote, filibuster reform or Senate reform, which means getting rid of the filibuster. Now, you support that, right?
I have never been a big supporter of getting rid of the filibuster, but I think that I'm getting to the point where we have to figure out some ways to modify it. Mm-hmm. It's funny, and a lot of the young writers around the prospect, Ezra, Matt Iglesias, Sam Rosenfeld, who was here a couple of years ago, were really emphatic during the Bush administration, during the nuclear option, during the battle over the nuclear option in 2006, right, or 2005. That we should give up the filibuster, even if it disadvantages Democrats at that moment, because ultimately it was going to be it was worse. The filibuster was more of a burden on the kinds of things that progressives want to achieve than it ever would be on the kinds of things that conservatives want to achieve. And I never quite agreed with that. I certainly wanted to I certainly thought you should retain the right of filibuster for, in particular for things like judicial nominees that are going to have an impact well beyond the current majority. It's the filibuster is not a constitutional provision, but to the extent that right of unlimited debate and, potentially under certain circumstances really forcing it to a something like a supermajority requirement, to the extent that that's relevant anywhere, it is as that kind of compensation for the power of temporary majorities. Of which the Republican majority of 2005, 2006 certainly was, and yet produced 2 Supreme Court justices and a lot of others who are going to have a very long impact. So I'm kind of ambivalent on the filibuster. I'd like to see. I think it's really like any kind of procedure. It takes different forms in different cultures. So that when you're in a culture now where the filibuster is enforced by the party leader. The filibusters against civil rights were not the creation of any party. They were cross-partisan filibusters, involving
actually
the
mostly
conservative.
Democrats, weren't they?
Well, there were at times there were more Democrats than Republicans, but it wasn't it wasn't led by the Democratic Party leader. It was a creation of that conservative coalition of Southern Democrats and Western and Midwestern conservative Republicans, but it wasn't. It was. You had the party division in Congress, and then cutting against it, you had the conservative liberal distinction, which didn't quite match up. So that a filibuster on a big issue like civil rights wasn't necessarily locked in by party. Now you have an absolutely partisan filibuster. Not to say that you didn't have that sometimes with Democrats as well, but it changes the nature of the filibuster. And of course, when you're at exactly 60-40, you have a totally disciplined filibustering 40 led by a party leader, so that it's not just the discipline around the filibuster itself, it's discipline around discipline within the party creates filibuster discipline. That creates a very different configuration. And it's not just that Obama needs 60 votes to do anything, as Bob Dole used to say. He needs the exact same 60 all the time, and there are lots of reasons why. It's very much a miracle that he got those for health care. I mean, you talk to anybody who is involved in health care, 3, 4, 5 months ago, they would have said, it'll either get 57 votes and fail, or it'll get 62 votes and succeed, because you're not going to get Ben Nelson and folks like Landrieu and Lincoln without some Republicans to give them some comfort. It's kind of amazing that it did. And when you get to things that have a different regional impact, what's that?
The price was high.
The price was high, yeah.
To get them.
Yeah.
Well,
and so I don't, at some point you have to have some kind of reform to that system so that it's not just, you can't just announce we're going to filibuster and then it's just stuck. Like, for example, change the rules so that the people who are actually doing the filibustering are the ones who have to show up, not the ones who want to move forward, so that Senator Inhofe can't take the day off while Senator Byrd has to be hauled in there.
Well, first of all, in November 2008, just after the election, National Review had a cruise, and one of the guest speakers was former Senator Fred Thompson. And here again, this was before anyone had taken office from the 2008 elections. And he said, look, you just got to remember, it's very, very simple. Don't know why everybody gets hung up on this. filibusters used to be bad, and now they're good. I think that's the process. That's what happens every time you change parties. Now, on the
well, that's
option,
not. I mean, again, that's not traditionally how the role that the filibuster has played. That's a very
the filibuster has traditionally been the tool of the minority party. I mean, I know you tried to disengage Democrats from the civil rights stuff, but the filibuster has traditionally been the tool of the minority party. And now, on this, for example,
the civil rights filibuster was not a project of the Democratic Party or the Senate Democratic leader who was for most of that period, which was the majority. It was the Southern Coalition. I mean, this pretty fundamental American political history.
But
it has not been a partisan tool. It became a partisan tool sometime around 93, 94, and partly that had to do with the realignment, so that the Democratic and Republican parties became a liberal party and a center-left party and a center-right party.
Well, and then that's also when Republicans actually took over the Congress in the House for the first time in more than 40 years.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In the case of the nuclear option, it was over a very, very specialized type of filibuster. I spoke extensively with senators during that, and I did not remember any of them wanting to do away with what they referred to as the legislative filibuster, even though Republicans were in the majority and Democrats were using the filibuster against them on various items of legislation at the time. The issue was the Democrats had decided in a very unprecedented way to use the filibuster to block an entire slate, I believe it was 10, of President Bush's nominees to the Federal Circuit Courts of Appeals. And this was something that, now the Republicans came up with an argument. They said that it actually blocked the Senate's responsibility to provide advice and consent. But it was clearly something, whether you buy that argument or not, it was clearly something that had not been done before. It was a significant escalation of the filibuster wars. And if you listen to what Republican leaders were saying at the time, and in Ezra Klein's Post article, he quotes Bill Frist, I think, grossly out of context. They were saying, look, we don't have any intention to touch the filibuster on legislation, but we want to stop the use of these filibusters for nominations. At the time, I was not even in favor of that. I thought Republicans should actually just win more seats in the Senate, and that would do it. But if you have a willful minority, you can stop things. And so what happened was the so-called Gang of 14 settlement, which not only did not do away with the filibuster, it actually, the judicial filibuster, it almost codified it. First of all, Democrats backed down on most of the appeals court nominees they had been blocking, and then they
including some rather extreme people like Judge Janice Rogers Brown, for example.
And
I mean, not to rehash all of that, but
and then they came up with this
these were
plan
nominees far out of the judicial mainstream.
And then they came up with this plan by which the Senate, each senator could do this judicial filibuster if they felt there were, quote, extraordinary circumstances involved. So what the fight over the filibuster involved in the judicial cases, I believe, it actually ended up in increasing the prevalence or strengthening the filibuster. So I don't think it was a great idea, but I thought the solution at the time was for Republicans to win more seats.
Right. Well, that wasn't happening.
They did. They went from 51 to 55, and even with 55, Democrats were still blocking them.
Right, but the nuclear option, the nuclear option was between that fight was between the 04 and the 06 election, and 06 was when they started losing seats.
Right. Well, they lost control of both the House and the Senate,
right.
No doubt about it. And,
right.
And in the last half term of a two-term president, he's not going to get that many judges confirmed anyway.
Right.
It just doesn't happen. So the battle, seemed to just kind of go away. But here we have it again over legislation, and I do want to throw out one more argument, and I should say who wrote this, and I can't remember it at the moment. But maybe it was Jim Manzi. No, it was Jay Cost, I think, Real Clear Politics. There's this idea, the parties have become more ideologically separated of late. You would concede that, right?
Oh, sure. More ideologically distinct.
The extremes of the parties have gotten a little more power in the past 10 to 20 years. And so the extreme on the left, this is in the Senate, the extreme on the left and the extreme on the right are a bit farther away from each other than they were a dozen years ago. So the question is, if you have parties that are more likely to act in ideological ways than they were in some mythical past, doesn't that make the filibuster actually more important? It allows the other party to sort of put a check on the extreme elements in the other party. And it results in things not being done sometimes, but it also results in not having the sort of extreme legislation that I'm sure some Democrats, as well as some commentators at the Washington Post and elsewhere, would like to see passed by 51 votes. So when the parties are actually more ideologically distinct, separated, and extreme than they used to be, the filibuster is actually more valuable than it was in the past.
Yes, I think that's somewhat true. When you put it in the current configuration, however, the result seems to be that it makes that senator who is 60th from the left, Ben Nelson, let's say. I mean,
right.
there's 60 senators more. There's 59 senators more liberal than him, and 40 senators more conservative than him. Let's say in a sort of simplified version of that political science line. It makes that individual almost the co-president. It gives the person at that nexus. When the 40 are completely opted out, it gives the person at that nexus who has the power to determine whether you do something or nothing. And a staggering amount of power in this particular configuration. In other configurations where you have a little more ideological crossover between the parties, a little less discipline. And not necessarily a 60-40 configuration, the filibuster gives a lot of individual senators a role to play, which I think is actually a healthy thing about the Senate, as opposed to the House, where everything is really driven by the leadership and the individual members have very little role to play. In this case, however, it's making the whole thing much more rigid.
But if you only had a 51 vote standard, couldn't the party in power do things that were a bit more extreme, and the 51st person from the left would become more important?
You'd have an easier time. It depends what your definition of an extreme is. I don't think a health care bill that largely structures a private market solution for providing health insurance is all that extreme. It's not
what
like
do you think the health care would be?
What
do you think the health care bill would be if they only needed 51 votes to do it?
I think it would have a very small public option that wouldn't pay Medicare rates.
Mm-hmm. I
think it would have a national exchange rather than state-based exchanges.
You could take the 9 most moderate Democrats and throw them out of the process, and it seems to me you would have something much closer to the House bill, wouldn't you?
You'd have something somewhat closer to the House bill. I still think I think there would still be a significant difference there. I think the public option would probably be quite different. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of senators who weren't enthusiastic about the kind of full-fledged public option. I don't have the I'm not sure exactly how many. You obviously you have a good chunk of somewhat moderate Democrats at this point.
Okay.
Before that probably gets you to about 50, and you're not dealing with Bernie Sanders when you're at 51.
So I guess wrapping this one up, I'm in favor of the filibuster. I'm sure people will be stunned to hear that, but you're actually kind of ambivalent about doing away with it.
Well, yeah, I'm ambivalent about doing away with it, but I do think that it's time to think about some reforms to it. And let me say, I think the interesting thing to do. Well, I think something a requirement that people actually, that the party the group that's filibustering has to show up and vote, so that you need 40 votes to block something, not 60 votes to move something forward. would be a step forward. I mean, it's the lazy filibuster is what is what I've always objected to. I mean, I think there's something really reasonable to a system that says, where we have, this is such a complicated country to govern, so many different regions, so many different interests. I think something that says, where there's a real intensity or passion of feeling about something, that the system should sort of measure that intensity as well as simply counting the votes. And the filibuster can be a good way to do that if you really make people, they really have to throw themselves into it. I mean, those Southerners did not want civil rights, and that's not a good thing in any way. But it was a measure of intensity of feeling, and I think there are times when that's a right thing to do. A large number of senators really did not want to see some of those Bush nominees on the courts. They really thought there'd be tremendous damage from that. So you're trying to measure some intensity. I think it's okay, but it's just sort of declaring. Let's have a cloture vote. If you don't get the 60, pull the bill. And also the number of hours that can be eaten up in these processes should be tightened up. But here's where I think this should all go. One reason that I think the Republicans were less concerned about the legislative filibuster in 2005, 2006 is that a lot of the things that they wanted to do outside of things like judicial nominations, they were able to do through budget reconciliation. What's called the 50-vote Senate, where it's really just rammed through. In 2005, they passed 2 different budget reconciliation bills. Mostly, those bills usually come up every 2-3 years, where a bill is considered under those special rules. They were able to do a lot of tax cutting, a lot of other policy under the 50-vote Senate. So they didn't really need to worry about it on a lot of legislative things. And I think, frankly, the Obama administration it was going to be very tough to do health care through reconciliation just because some of the rules about it. There are a lot of other things that they're going to be able to do through that system. So I think there's maybe the basis for a compromise here, to the extent that anybody's willing to talk to anybody, where you ramp down the power of that budget reconciliation process a little bit, because that is a totally closed process. It doesn't, completely controlled by the majority party, and really only by, 4 or 5 people within the majority party in the Senate, in exchange for some modification of the filibuster, so that it really does have to measure intensity of opposition, not just that lazy filibuster. So that's my proposal for the week, which I'm going to write up for Monday.
Well, I look forward to seeing that. It is true that the Senate has made filibusters easy over the years. I mean, it's interesting how many readers still have the idea that the filibuster still involves kind of a Mr. Smith goes to Washington scenario,
right,
when basically it's kind of like you're at an auction and you tip your hand a little bit or you scratch your nose and bang, there's a filibuster. They've made it extremely easy to do. Making it a little more difficult would not be a crazy idea. Now, I guess this actually can take us to Democratic prospects, because I was reading just a moment ago Charlie Cook saying, and I think everyone would agree with this, that the chances of Democrats keeping their 60-vote majority come November are almost non-existent. And if you've seen some articles around lately, I can think of one at National Review that had a picture of Scott Brown, the senatorial candidate in Massachusetts, said the man who could stop Obamacare. And it does seem like, I think all of us have trouble wrapping our head around the idea of a Republican winning in Massachusetts, but it does seem like the Democratic Party has gotten a scare in it, and is now sending some big guns and money to Massachusetts and kind of, prodding the candidate there, Martha Coakley, the Democrat, to campaign a little more vigorously, because the possibility of a loss or a narrow win just hadn't occurred to them before.
Right, sure. And, and she's turned out to be a very lackluster candidate. I've never really been able to, during the primary, I kept saying to people, what's the case for or against Martha Coakley? And I knew people who were for other candidates or for her, and I never really got a clear answer in any respect. So she seems like a very a lifeless candidate who also dropped off the radar immediately after winning the primary. You combine
She
that
just didn't
with Deval
campaign,
Patrick's,
I don't think.
yeah. Combine that with Deval Patrick's unpopularity, and you have
Right.
you have the ingredients for and a sort of, I think unknown, attractive Republican who doesn't carry any of the baggage of any other history, and you have the ingredients for something that maybe looks like a race.
Well, now let me ask you, what do you think the storyline that we got out of last November's elections were big victories Republican victories in Virginia and New Jersey, and I know the whole New York 23 stuff, but the bigger storyline I think that came out was, Republicans may be kind of coming back. What kind of results in Massachusetts would be necessary to A, stop that storyline, or B, keep it going?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think in a sense, it's probably kept it going. It's probably enough has already happened that it will kind of keep the Republicans on the comeback storyline going. I mean, Coakley's not going to win by the same. I think Obama won the state by 23 points. I don't think Coakley's going to win by that margin. So that's it. On the other hand, she's going to be a U.S. senator, so it doesn't matter that much. But I think that story keeps going and then kind of gets put to the test over the course of next year. I mean, if you have some feeling of economic recovery, you have debilitating Republican primaries, situations comparable to New York 23. Those are bad. Those are bad ingredients for the Republican chances as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me that I have a hard time seeing. And of course, we don't know the future, and all of this may be determined by events that not only have not happened, but that we could never foresee. So, saying all that, Republicans are in a situation, given that their opposition has a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. I think they're in a position to get better in the Senate. If they get one more vote, they're a whole lot better. I mean, back in 2008, Mitch McConnell was telling anybody who would listen about what he called the power of 41, which he said was the power to shape legislation or to block legislation. And, of course, the corollary to that is if you don't have 41, you are nowhere. You are dead. And, of course, they've learned that from experience now. So
I in a sense, I disagree with both of those. I mean, there are enough difficult Democrats, as we Democrats well know, that it actually would be really healthy to have more of those, to have some working relationships with at least some Republicans, which have not been there. And the challenge, I think, for McConnell is you use this power to. Is there any point where you'll use this power to shape rather than block?
Are you are you saying it might be better for Democrats to have fewer than a majority, but fewer than 60 votes in the Senate? In that, I personally believe, for example, in this whole ping pong or conference process, that it would be better to have Republican voices involved. But I totally understand Democrats who have total control not wanting that. But if they had to do it, it would be better, and I think the legislation, which is bad and probably unfixable in my view, would still be somewhat better than what we're going to get the way it is now. So I think it'd actually be better for the Democratic Party, they would never say this, that if they had fewer than 60 votes in the Senate.
I think it would actually. I don't totally disagree with that, and I also think that even though there's very little overlap between the parties right now, there is some, and I think when you're in a room with Olympia Snow, there's a little more room for a real conversation that there's an actual that there's a desire to achieve health reform. If she's freed from all party considerations, there's maybe that's not a conversation that's very different from the one with Ben Nelson, and it's probably actually less craven than the one with Ben Nelson.
Well, look, I think that if I think this is a terrible bill, but I do think if Snow, Collins, Grassley, Hatch, a number of these Republicans had been involved with it, it wouldn't be as bad, and it would probably help Democrats' political fortunes, although that's not the intention.
Right. But I mean, all that opportunity was there. This is a bill that incorporated as many Republican ideas as you can possibly draw out of it. I mean, this is a bill that in 93, 94, the Republicans would have embraced a bill like this.
Really? You think so?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is you want market-driven healthcare solutions, this is a market-driven healthcare solution.
Mm-hmm. You mean by the creation of these exchanges and by forcing everybody into the market, you mean?
Yeah, by creating. I mean, you have to have everybody in the market in order to have a market that works for everybody. That's the nature of insurance.
Right,
and that's not something we object to.
But there's a level of government coercion that is, I think, Republicans are very uncomfortable with.
Well, you had 13 Republicans sign on to Ron Wyden's bill, which really put the individual mandate at the center of it.
I agree with you, but that means a lot of Republicans are very uncomfortable with this sort of mandate that's enforced by the IRS. That just the whole coercive nature of it.
Well, some number of Republicans are uncomfortable with anything on health reform. Those Republicans who have been interested in health reform were interested in the Wyden approach, which was really all about the individual mandate. So,
but why don't we have the Wyden approach? With 60 Democrats, we don't have it because the Democrats
I think the ultimate reason it was always lurking out there as an interesting question for me is there any point at which you sort of wheel around and do this other thing? I think ultimately the problem with the Wyden approach was it was pushing too quickly to eliminate the employer role. And I think the disruptiveness of eliminating the employer role and the fact that actually creates a lot of chaos for people who are, it really violates that principle of if you're happy with what you have, you'll be able to keep it. It was probably the biggest problem with that. But we basically have a big component of the Wyden bill, which is the individual mandate. The individual mandate with subsidies and no public option is the basic structure of the Wyden bill.
And it's a major part of the bill that we have now.
Well, that's what I'm saying, and that's something that had I think the number actually got as high as 13. It was Grassley, it was Bennett, it was a very large number of Republicans who signed on to that bill in the last Congress and in the current one. So it was a choice. It was very much a Republican choice to opt out of this debate. It was not an Obama. It was not an Obama choice to shut them out. You had that. I think it was 6 weeks of the Gang of Six negotiating, out of which ultimately nothing happened. So it might well be better for Republicans to be involved. But my opinion about that doesn't really matter very much.
No,
Mitch McConnell's opinion about whether he's going to allow Republicans to be involved matters a lot more.
Well, I do not fault Democrats for going it alone because they can. I mean, that is the nature of parties. I just don't. Parties are not bipartisan, so I don't fault them on that. But I do think it would have been better if they had to. I think some sort of forced or artificial bipartisanship where they bend over backwards to get Olympia Snowe to go with them is not bipartisanship. But if Democrats only had 55 in the Senate, then it might have been a different role. But given that Republicans messed up so badly and lost so badly that Democrats got 60 seats, then here we are. It's not something I blame Democrats for doing. Now,
well, I don't think Democrats did it. I think Barack Obama wants to do. I mean, I get this from the left all the time for how moronic I am to believe that there was any value in Obama's bipartisanship, and people say it was a complete waste of time to spend those 6 weeks or however long it was, 2 months with the Gang of Six. They should have just done this thing by reconciliation, or just moved more quickly with it. And again, it's in the nature of Obama. It's in the nature of Max Baucus to want to do this thing in a bipartisan way. It was a set of ideas that had a lot of bipartisan history. The fact that it wasn't isn't just that they weren't forced to. The interesting thing about when you have, if it were a different number, if Republicans had 45, say, I think there's much more obligation at that point to participate in governing. And the interesting thing, I mean, Tebby Troy, who's an old friend of mine who's been writing on health reform for National Review, had a thing the other day where he cited something I'd written where he said, basically, if Republicans want to be part of this health conversation, you've got to start having some real ideas that we sort of put some energy into building some consensus around over a period of years. And I think that's a really good point. I think, in fact, they probably had. I think some of those ideas were out there, and in fact, they were in the bill. And because it was Obama's bill, because it was a bill supported by Democrats, there was a political choice not to engage with that.
Well, there was certainly a political choice on that, and I think you're probably correct about saying that when a party is down to 40. And they know the other guys have the whole power to do everything themselves, there is a tendency to say, well, y'all just take care of it yourself. We'll talk to you later. Because they don't have any real role. And here again, I'm not blaming Democrats for winning 60 seats. Republicans should blame themselves every morning for losing so many seats. But when you have that situation, it does not lead to bipartisanship. No way. So, now,
it certainly could have.
Well,
or maybe the folks to my left are right that nobody should have wasted any time on that stuff. I mean, that means a big chunk of the year was wasted on trying to achieve bipartisanship.
Now, I should know this, but I mean, it is true that certainly in the cases of Medicare, there were clear bipartisan majorities. I think Medicare passed with about 70 votes, and it got a lot of votes, Republican votes, in the House, and I think the Senate was 13 Republicans in favor, 17 against. I'm saying that off the top of my head. There were only 30 Republicans in the Senate at that time. But the Republican Party was about split. About half of Republicans, nearly half.
But let's be clear. Let's be clear. That included Republicans named Jacob Javits, Lowell Weicker. I'm not sure he was in the Senate yet at that time. John Chafee. You had at least 10 to 12 Republicans who today those seats are held by Democrats. They themselves would be Democrats, and they would be roughly in the middle of the Democratic Party.
But we've often heard the argument that Republicans didn't support Medicare, and in fact, nearly half of them in the Senate voted for it. And you can say maybe they're old-fashioned Republicans, and they wouldn't be Republicans today. I believe there was an exchange when Hillary Clinton was doing her health care reform in 1993. I believe she had a conversation with Pat Moynihan, and I think Moynihan said something to the effect to her, 70 votes. You got to have 70, something this big. You need 70 votes. And I think she told him to get out of her way. And in the past, with things that big, we have had bigger vote totals. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think this will probably be the biggest piece of legislation, most extensive, far-reaching, affecting people's lives type of legislation to pass on a pure party vote. And it could be that if it turns out to be absolutely fabulous, Republicans will never live it down. Could happen the other way around. But this is kind of an interesting situation we're in now, where we have something that is so big that in the past it had been passed with bipartisan majorities, and here it's not.
Yes, that's true. I mean, it's just the nature of our party system. I mean, the nature of the party system is so different. It was the choice of the Republicans to not
Mark, what's so crazy about Republicans? I mean, look at the polls on the health care reform bills on the table. The polls have been, since late summer, have been negative. You can go to Real Clear Politics, you can go to pollster.com and watch those lines intersect, and then opposition grow and grow and grow. Democrats are passing something that the public doesn't want. Now, maybe they think the public doesn't know about it, and if they really knew about it, they would want it, but it doesn't seem to be crazy for a minority party that actually, in this case, reflects the majority of American opinion to vote against this thing.
Well, they don't reflect. There's never been a majority against the bill. There was never even a majority against the public option. Opposition grew. Opposition grew as well-funded opposition was out there. That's the nature of...
opposition grew as bills were written and people learned what was in the bills. There wasn't a bill until late summer.
And what's the thing in the bill that you think people object to? What's the thing that if Democrats say, okay, we'll take that out,
I think the basic public reason for opposition is that they do not believe the president and Democrats claim that you can insure millions of currently uninsured people and save money in the process. And they believe that the only way that it can be paid for is by rationing care or raising taxes, and they're opposed to those. I think that is the fundamental belief underlying the majority opposition to the Democratic health reform effort.
Okay, so it's basically like it won't work, and whatever the CBO says isn't going to be true.
That's correct.
Okay,
absolutely. I believe that. I do not believe that it's possible to insure millions more Americans and save money in the process. Don't believe it.
Okay.
Now, we were going to talk about the end. At the end, we were going to talk about Republican prospects, and I was going to mention a new column out today by my friend Jonah Goldberg, and it's basically what Republicans can learn from a pizza chain. And what happens is Domino's Pizza has revamped its whole product. They apparently have new crust and new cheese and new sauce, and it's all just fantastic.
This is like classic Jonah Goldberg.
It is absolutely great. And Domino's has done a video on how they did this that's now being seen by lots of people on YouTube, something called Pizza Turnaround. But the whole point is that Domino's began to pay attention to the consumer feedback they were getting. And the consumer feedback was overwhelmingly to the effect of, the crust tastes like cardboard, the sauce tastes like ketchup, microwave pizzas are better than this. Mm-hmm. So in this sort of welcoming of criticism, Domino's, endures all of this. They go to focus groups. Apparently you go to a focus group and you talk about pizza, and so they're watching from behind the one-way mirrors, so they learn that consumers just hate their product. And I guess they order it mostly because it gets there in 30 minutes.
Right.
So anyway, they've listened to all this, and they've come up with a better product. And now they've come out and told the American people, we've listened to your concerns, and now we're better. And I think Jonah's point is that Republicans could learn something from that. The question is, I'm not sure. My response to Jonah is I'm not entirely sure what they should learn. Should they listen to the consumers who were saying they want a Republican Party that hews more to traditional conservatism, in their view, sort of Reagan-esque conservatism, or should they listen to the consumers who want a Republican Party that is more inclusive and pays attention to the social concerns of younger voters and realizes that the country is changing demographically and all of those other things? Do they want the thick crust or the thin crust, or how do Republicans conduct this market research and react accordingly? But the point is that you've got a company, the Republican company, that realizes voters are unhappy with them, and they need to actually listen to them and try to make some changes to respond to those specific voters' unhappinesses.
Right. Well, but your question is the big one, because it's a question of what you consider your market to be. And if your market is the Tea Partiers, you've got a different. You're doing something different than if your market is, a large number of younger voters, voters who are less interested in the sharp partisanship, who do want something to be done about health care. That's got to be the market, and it's very hard for the current Republican Party seems to be having a harder time understanding that its market is not just its own true believers.
Well, this is my feeling about this. Clearly, the Republican Party was roundly rejected in 2006 and in 2008. On the other hand, as far as political recovery is concerned, the single most important factor in any party's political recovery is having the other guys mess up. And
Sure.
that's absolutely critical for Republicans. And if things get
Right.
better, if unemployment goes down, there's perception that the economy is getting better, Republicans are not going to be in good shape in November. But if it does, if the opposite occurs, I think they will be in good shape. I think we have an interesting situation here where voters are clearly in the polls registering their unhappiness with the Democratic Party for some of the reasons we talked about, which is the party is racing to do things that voters don't want. They're unhappy with that. But
or
they
not
just
doing
roundly
or
rejected
not doing things that people do want. I mean,
But-
they're because of the concentration on health care, the delay on health care, and obstruction, there hasn't been an ability to move aggressively to a jobs agenda.
The
for
president
example.
put health care on the agenda. Health care is not the number one agenda of the administration and Democrats in Congress because Mitch McConnell said so. It is a
Right.
Democratic choice, and people are not unhappy with it. So voters, I think, are clearly registering their unhappiness with the Democratic Party, but they just threw Republicans out a little more than a year ago. They're not happy with Republicans. They don't particularly like them. So what we have is a weird race in which normally after an election, the victorious party governs for a while and the losing party recovers for a while. And I think what we have now is a situation in which the victorious party is screwing up faster than the losing party can recover. And we have a situation where in November, I don't know where the two sides will be. It could go either way. But you have a situation in which there is, I think, growing voter unhappiness with both parties. It's older with Republicans because they've been sick of them for at least 3 years now, 4 years. But it's newer and hotter with Democrats. So I think that's going to make November very difficult to predict because of this factor of voters not being ready to hand things over to Republicans again so quickly, even though they're unhappy with Democrats now.
I think that's actually. I mean, I don't disagree with that. I don't know that it's hard to disaggregate what people might call unhappiness with Democrats, unhappiness with Washington generally, disappointment that the crazy expectations of Obama have obviously not been completely fulfilled. And how both Obama and the administration are going to deal with that over the course of the next year. I mean, a good dose of kind of running against Washington, which Republicans were always very good at, even when they controlled all branches of government, might be the answer here for Obama as well. But I think that's basically right. The other dimension of this that I think is interesting for the two parties, I think I've said this before on Bucking Heads, but I've always had this theory about the 90s that the real Republican strength was not in Newt Gingrich and his gang in Congress, who really accomplished very little, but in governors. And in those governors who gave one a sense, the big state Republican governors of the 1990s like Ridge and Engler in Michigan and so forth, who gave people a sense that there was such a thing as a Republican, fairly conservative Republican who was able to govern. And I think people thought George W. Bush was one of those. Gave people a sense of comfort and sense of competence about the Republican Party. That I don't know that. My theory had been that that's where the Republican recovery will come from, and maybe it's people like Christie and McDonnell in Virginia, or Mitch Daniels, or Pawlenty, maybe. But A, there aren't nearly as many of them as there were, and B, it's just not going to be a good time to be a governor. Nobody's going to come out of being a governor over the next 2-3 years and look like heroes unless it's a very idiosyncratic situation.
Well,
So
I disagree with one thing about 1994, which I think was, and I disagree in a way that I think could be relevant today. I think that 1994 was certainly a national election, and I think that after Clinton had come into office and tried health care and failed, and had sort of distracting things like gays in the military, I think the voters basically decided to elect a chaperone for the president. And the chaperone was giving the Congress over to the Republican Party and creating divided government. And actually both, you could argue, prospered after that, at least until the Lewinsky matter. So, I mean, there are Democrats who kind of feel that way today, but it's entirely possible if voters were to give a majority of either House or Senate to Republicans, or even if they increase their minority significantly, I think it will be this sense of electing a chaperone and deciding that, hey, you know, we do really kind of like divided government. We were discussed with the Republicans. We're not saying we did the wrong thing in 06 and 08, but we think we'd like a little balance on the president right now.
It's a really interesting kind of political science-y question, because it's really hard to imagine people voting that tactically, since they are, of course, voting for an individual representative, not for
but you know, there does
majority.
seem to emerge
but there's all
from
kinds
elections.
of. I mean, the prevalence of divided governments. You know, that simple fact of how rare those moments are when we don't have divided government over the last 30 years or so. Is a strong basis for that argument. I mean, I think in '94 there were a lot of seats that were just ready to pop. There were a lot of Democrats who'd been sitting on districts that had been voting for Reagan and Bush, and all along they were just kind of ready to go, and all they needed was the provocation of an actual activist Democratic president. To flip them, but and again, and this goes to the would Democrats be worse off with a few less senators, which I'm not fully willing to concede. But there was a period, kind of between the Clinton re-election in '96 and the Lewinsky garbage. There was a period that was actually one of the most productive periods in political history, the period where S-chip was passed, for example, and the budget agreement that got everything, that really brought us back to budget balance and everything. It was tremendously productive, about a year and a half in there, of divided government, and I'm not willing to go all the way there because I think that the current Republican Party has to be willing to stop being purely obstructionist before I'm willing to say that there's any possibility there, but if it's willing to not be a purely obstructionist party, I think there is some possibility that divided government might not be the a moderately not divided government, but not having a filibuster-proof majority in addition to both houses of Congress might not be the worst thing.
All right, I think that would be a reasonable place for us to leave it.
I hope I don't lose my job over
Schmitt
something like that.
endorses Republican victory in 2010.
I don't. All right, Byron.
All right, enjoyed it, Mark. Let's
count
down and say goodbye.
Okay.
1, 2, 3. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.